Clause 4, context of the organization. Clause 4.1, understanding the organization and its context. The organization shall determine external and internal issues that are relevant to its purpose and its strategic direction, and that affect its ability to achieve the intended results of its quality management system. The organization shall monitor and review information about these external and internal issues. Let's just consider this for a moment. There's two parts to this subclause. The first is asking us to determine something. And the next part is saying is we're asked to monitor and review. Okay. There's the two requirements here now. Let's get into it a bit deeper.
Okay.
Want to come in there, Phil?
Yeah, I was just going to say that essentially, when we're talking about issues that affect strategic direction, purpose and its strategic direction, we have to keep in mind that the issues can be of all different types. The issues aren't necessarily of a strategic nature. They're, more likely to be small issues, and whether they're to do with the operating environments, to do with the market that you're in, culture is mentioned, and there are a whole load of things that are generally outside of the actual operating environment, but may impact upon them. So this is why they're saying external and internal issues that affect the purpose and the direction. And again, I just wanted to stress that point. Sorry for interrupting your stride, but I think from a perspective of, really nailing this clause, Vincent, you've commented numerous times that this is one of the most important clauses because it sets out, a lot of the context literally for how we're going to manage the rest of the standard and work our way through the clauses with these issues in mind. I'll hand over to you on that one.
Right. Yeah, this is the one that sets the scene for everything. It would be lovely to dip in further along the way to the much more tangible day-to-day parts of running your business. But it's very important to set the scene, because what we do here, you'll build on layer from this.
Yes.
And it's the starting point. Now, it is the most difficult kind of conceptual, more long-term clause of them all. So bear that in mind.
Yes.
If we just delve into some of the words in this now, in internal and external issues. Now, an issue can be positive or negative. It's important to just remember that as well. The purpose of the organization. Let's just say for the moment is you're a profit-making company, you employ people, and you make a contribution some way to the good of the economy. And well, just think simply about your purpose like that. That's all. Don't get caught up in the esoterics or anything of it, right?
Yeah, I think it really, though, relevant to its purpose and strategic direction combined, speaks to the organization operating in a particular market. And the purpose would include the expectations of that market that the company is serving. So issues will arise when you consider the operating environment, which includes the market that they're operating in, not just the location that they're operating in. Yeah. So it's the operating environment provides the contextual issues. When we look through the notes, which are excellent in the standard, they really do prompt you to consider things in a very broad scope. Note 1, you've already covered with issues being positive and negative. Note 2, I mean, if I just read it out loud so that everyone gets a handle on the words, understanding the external context can be facilitated by considering issues that arise from legal, technological, competitive, market, cultural, social and economic environments, whether international, national, regional, or local. I mean, looking at that, there's a lot in that. But I guess what an auditor is going to be looking for when they come in to audit a company, any organization, and they're looking at this clause, the expectation of the auditor really is that, the management team has a real good understanding of how it sees itself in its own market. This is the purpose, and the strategic direction will provide a number of other considerations, because it's not about where you're going, it's about the fact that you're on a journey towards that endpoint in some way. So the issues aren't going to be there when you arrive. The issues are impacting you now while you're on the journey to that strategic direction. And I think importantly, as we've discovered with a lot of our clients, doesn't matter whether you're, a multinational or a very small micro business, issues happen, issues impact, events provide issues like COVID and Brexit, which are very current now in the last month of 2020. So I guess when we're looking at the market in particular, when we're looking at the competitive environment, when we're looking at where we operate from a point of view of the jurisdictions or the domains or the regions or countries we operate in, those environments will provide issues that need to be considered. I suppose one of the things that's very important to understand is there's also a simplicity to all of this, because most people who will be watching this video will understand what a SWOT analysis is. Maybe some will understand what PESTLE is. And essentially what we're doing is we're determining the issues that need to be considered for that type of risk assessment, SWOT, PESTLE analysis, to determine how are we going to proceed? Are there any actions we can take now to mitigate particular issues and risks? Are there any things that we may not be able to mitigate, but we need to consider because of the environment and the potential for it to interrupt us in our operations? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I like that idea, that saying of the simplicity. So
Yes.
let's just take that SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. For those that are not used to that, strengths and weaknesses tend to be internal to the organization.
Yeah.
Opportunities and threats are external, positive,
Yes.
negative. But it just says go off and whiteboard it. So if you're not used to or don't understand the organization, this clause here gives you lots of direction.
Yes.
It says look externally, look internally, look at the political, the market, the culture, look at the international, look at the local, look at regional. It gives it to you, tells you where to go looking.
Yes.
Right? And then if we move on to note 3 now is inside the organization. And it tells you, don't just say strengths and weaknesses, but it says related to values, culture, knowledge, and performance.
Yes.
So it gives a clarity of where exactly to go looking for this.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And if I might just say, like people would say, but your people come in, it's a manufacturing company. People come in, they work and they go home and they get paid at the end of the week or the end of the month. And
Yes.
so what's all this about values and culture? Well, they're there, whether we like it or not, in an organization.
Just a small story. I remember sitting with a potential client who became a client actually, right? But I remember he was actually with the equivalent of a PA or a secretary. This is going back a few years, and I remember, going through kind of a questionnaire and taking some notes. And I asked the question, can you describe the culture in your organization? And the response I got back was a little bit curt, but basically saying, I'm trying to run a business here. I've no time for considering culture, right? And the next question I asked was, how would your employees describe the culture in the organization? And the person accompanying this business owner was drinking a cup of tea at the time and spat the tea back out into the cup. And I said, right then, that's the answer to that. But I guess the point there is, if you don't manage the culture in your organization, it will manage itself.
Mm.
So one of the things we're looking for in this clause is for you to recognize and acknowledge the culture and to look at that culture to see, does it of itself provide opportunities or potential issues that need to be treated as risks?
Yeah, I had a manager when I worked in corporate some years back, and he said, culture is what they do when you're not around. And I thought it was brilliant. It just captures it. I had, while we're on that, two friends of the same name. One had a car valeting company and the other had a 24-hour breakdown assist. When one guy went on holidays, the productivity went up because
Yes.
he trusted them and he built a culture.
Yes.
And the others, if he didn't micromanage it, the productivity went right down.
Yes.
And it was quite amazing. Both and I had big professional organizations, like huge numbers of people, but the culture was just completely different.
Yes.
It was very interesting as to how it actually supported self-running of the organization.
But I'm going to use as well, I mean, and I don't want to spend too much on culture because there's so much else that can be
Yes.
spoken about here. But just one consideration for culture would be that, you know, there are also subcultures. So for example, there might be no recognizable culture being, you know, espoused by management. However, you could find that in the sales team, there's a leader there that drives a particular type of culture within their own environment. And likewise in operations and purchasing and so on. And I suppose what we're looking for is the management team to identify the cultures that are present, because culture happens. If you decide to do nothing about it, there's still going to be a culture there. And that culture could be complacency or laissez-faire, or sure, there's no point in me arriving at 9 o'clock. Nobody cares. I'll just arrive in at 9:15. And it becomes the culture, you know. But I think the other thing that needs to be considered as well is, and it's very important here, is going back to note 2, and understanding external context can be facilitated by considering issues arising from legal obligations, right? So right the way through all of the management system standards, but most importantly in this 9001, which is the fundamental or umbrella standard for all of this ISO community. Essentially, when an auditor is coming in, they're looking to see that, you know, when you've looked at who your regulators are and, you know, the types of obligations you have towards legislation, regulation, market regulation as well. So you could be, you know, you might have a compliance issue with it because a customer is extending its compliance obligations onto you, for example. Well, these legal obligations, which, you know, we can all think of the typical stuff that any company would be obliged to adhere to. But in addition to that, more recently, we had GDPR come in 2018, and it's had a huge impact on business. And it had a huge impact on the formality that businesses are required to demonstrate. But I also think when you're looking at legal obligations and you're thinking about an ISO 9001 auditor coming in to evaluate the business against the criteria, the standard, the legal obligations that arise from who your regulators are, what you're obliged to do in law, the different things, health and safety, environmental, particularly information security, because it's so topical, that those issues need to be documented. And the other side of it then is, you know, the issues that arise from contractual arrangements, from market pressures, market demands, trends in the market. Technology is brought into it as well, because, you know, a company needs to keep up with the latest thinking in technology to a degree, because, you know, the market is, you know, your competitors are. And if you're not at least aware of what the technology can do for you and what your competitors are using in that regard, you're definitely going to find yourself lagging behind. And I think really, you know, to look and summarize on understanding the organization and its context.
Let me, Phil, just go back up to some of the words I want to make sure that we've covered off. And factors or conditions for consideration. At this stage, we're using words like consider because we're not fixing everything at this point in time.
Good point.
And monitoring and reviewing. And we, in order to assist us, what are we considering?
Yes.
So it's very important that people don't overthink this clause. It's really setting the scene and writing down where we're at the moment in terms of internal and external.
Yes, and I think it's also with regard to the second piece of criteria there for monitoring and reviewing, you know, really the monitoring requires somebody to be assigned with the responsibility for monitoring, and the reviewing likewise. But I think really what we'd be looking for as consultants working with our client companies is we would be strongly recommending that they nominate a management representative for each of those issues, particularly the significant issues. so that when it comes to reporting on them, well, at least the owner of the business or the board knows, well, you know, for example, there are a number of issues in the sales department. Well, you make sure that the sales manager or equivalent knows that they are responsible for monitoring those issues and reporting to the board or the management team on those issues if there are any changes or different impacts or things don't turn out as we expect. So the whole area of responsibility and ownership comes into play here. And I thought that's a very important thing to at this point.
Tell me this, would you like to then differentiate for our viewers between monitor and review?
Well, you know, monitoring is literally that bit where you're taking measurements. Review is subsequent. So for example, the printing press, you know, you might be asked to print 20,000 copies of a brochure. And it's one thing to monitor the printing. So for example, you might take, you know, on a 20,000 run, you might take 1 in 1,000 out and check the quality of the print for meeting the specification of the job and so on, and record that measurement. But towards the end of the job, and there might be ongoing kind of reviews happening at that point, because if the measure doesn't fall within certain parameters, it might strike an action. For example, you might have a tolerance of plus or minus, you know, a percentage or something. And when you measure, it falls outside of the acceptable parameters. Well, that requires you to stop the process and fix the issue. It's monitoring and the bit of analysis that's required at the monitoring moment, if you like. The operator who's monitoring is required to just make sure it's within the parameters defined. The reviewing comes afterwards. You know, so for example, there might be a trend that develops. So it's always plus or minus 0.5%, and that's acceptable. But the trend is that it fluctuates highly between those parameters. So it's quite acceptable so long as it's within the parameters and you're monitoring the trend. But if something in the trend was to indicate that it was about to go outside of the acceptable parameters, that's where you might stop and intervene. But I suppose the monitoring is the important bit at this stage, really, to understand. And I guess even beyond the monitoring, it's the commitment to monitoring that's very important. You know?
Right. And I think we've fairly much gone through every part of this.
I would agree. I guess, you know, we will add to this in future videos. So
yeah,
it's not that it's very much an introduction to ISO 9001 at the very start, where I guess when you're looking at it from the auditor's perspective, they really want to see that you're keeping, you know, a formal view on those issues so that you can keep the operation informed of the issues which might impact them or impede them as they go about their work. Other than that, happy days.
Okay, that's clause 4, context of the organization.
But it's clause 4.1, understanding the organization and its context. Take it.